Well, good morning, everybody. As Adrian said, my name is Ronnie Westerman. Many of you will know Ian better through my husband, through his work trying to raise the profile of Ajar. We've been in this fellowship for the last, over 12 months now, since we came to Nairobi from the UK. It's great, isn't it, to have a chance to dig into prayer some more. I think it's a topic you can't dig into enough. And I've really appreciated the last few talks on prayer. I was away actually for 3 of them, and it was great to catch up on the YouTube channel. Can I just give a big appreciation to Christian and the production team for the work they do. It's such high quality, isn't it? And the great thing is that it's something that we can proudly share with friends, families, even people who are just unchurched. Welcome to view that, knowing that it's something we can be proud of. So I recommend that if you haven't seen the YouTube channel for Renewal Church Nairobi, do have a look. So far in this series, we've looked at lament, confusion, expectation, discerning God's will. And today we're going to look at arguing with God. Shall we pray now before we do that? Heavenly Father, thank you that you're the God of Abraham who promised to come and meet with us. We so often fail in prayer, and we know that you long to engage with us. Would you just open our hearts and minds today? As we look at Abraham's prayer life, would you change us, challenge us, that we wouldn't go away from here unchanged? Amen. So we're going to look at Abraham. We're looking at Genesis 18, but before we do that, and we read that together, let's have a look at the context, because I think Abraham's journey is a key part of his interaction with God in Genesis chapter 18. So his journey starts in Genesis chapter 12, when God calls him out. He says, "Go out and I will make you a great nation. Make your name great, that you will be a blessing. In you, all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed." So what we're looking at today isn't an isolated incident. It's part of the journey. The journey is one of discovering God and his plans for and through Abraham, rather than Abraham exposing his ambitions and plans and getting God to help him with those. You see, right from the beginning, it's God's initiation and God's plan. Abraham, as he was then, set out on a really epic journey. He went to an unknown land. He got established in Canaan, only to experience famine and go to Egypt. He got into difficulty there, of course. When he came back, he had to rescue Lot when he was captured and taken away. And then most recently, before this episode we're going to read today, he had a really intense covenant ritual encounter with God. And in Genesis chapter 17, at the age of 99, he and all the men in his household were circumcised as a sign of that beginning of that covenant. And throughout that journey, he's had a number of encounters with God. This is not the first time in 18 that God has spoken with him. He's had conversations with God. He's come back at God. He's actively participated in this covenant ritual with God in chapter 15. And God has already appeared to him. We know that in chapter 17 as well. And he's spoken to him and told him details about what he'll do immediately, what he'll do in the near future, but also the result of his son Isaac and his son Isaac's 12 sons, that they will go into exile in Egypt, that they'll be there for some time, and the Exodus God talks about with Abraham, and he talks about judging the Amorites, with whom Abraham is having a few problems at the moment. All of those things are happening over hundreds of years. This is big canvas stuff for Abraham and God. It's a journey where Abraham's made lots of mistakes. He's pretended that Sarah wasn't his wife on 2 occasions, and that got him into big trouble. He's taken Hagar as a second wife in order to try and drive forward God's promise and fulfill God's promise himself. There's signs that he hasn't trusted God completely, but that he is still interacting with him. He's definitely not perfect. And he lives in an imperfect and sinful region. Genesis 13, we learn that the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord, and oppressing the local area too, where Abraham is settled in what we would now call the sort of West Bank. So it's part of a bigger picture, and we need to understand that bigger picture. We need to know that Abraham's on a journey. He's getting to know God, God of a promise, God of protection, and God of covenant relationship. And it's not just Abraham and his household that God cares about, but we find out here and elsewhere in this journey that God cares about all of the nations amongst whom he's living. So God appears to Abraham in chapter 18 of Genesis. Shall we read that together? I think it's going to come up on the screen, but also we have 4 volunteer readers who are going to give us a dramatized reading of this one. And would you like to come up now?
18. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground.
If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant.
Very well, do as you say.
So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah.
Quick, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it, and bake some bread.
Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf, and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set this before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree.
Where's your wife, Sarah?
There, in the tent.
Then one of them said,
I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son.
Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought,
After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?
Then the Lord said to Abraham,
Why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son.
Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said,
Hey, I did not laugh.
Yes. Yes, you did laugh.
When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said,
Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know.
The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said,
Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?
If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake.
Now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5 people?
If I find 45 there, I will not destroy it.
What if there are only 40 there?
For the sake of 40, I will not do it.
May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?
I will not do it if I find 30 there.
Now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?
For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it.
May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there.
For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it.
When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home.
Thank you, team. That is just part of the Mountain View community group. Didn't they do well? This is kind of a weird passage because we have these three mysterious visitors. We're not sure who they are, but we know that the Lord is amongst them because Jehovah, Yahweh, is named in the passage as speaking, and that's the part that Kehoto played today. So Abraham, perhaps still recovering from that circumcision, is sitting in the shade in the heat of the day. He sees three strangers approaching. He goes out to meet them. He urges them to join for lunch, which, by the way, is huge, just for three people. But this is Kenyan style, not, this proper feast. The Lord speaks through the visitors and promises for a second time that Sarah will bear a child about this time next year. And it's clear that Sarah certainly, and probably Abraham, don't really believe it yet. But key is that God says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Just part of that growing relationship is what Abraham is hearing. So Abraham chooses to go with the travelers as they leave. He says in verse 16, Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And then we hear this strange interaction where God sort of thinks out loud and says, shall I share my plans with Abraham? Shall I do that? Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do in verse 17? And he decides he will share, and he gives his reasoning, which is really useful for us, right? I've chosen him, he says in verse 19, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring Abraham what he has promised him. And there's a sense of God sharing his plan with Abraham in order to show Abraham how to be more like him as a leader, as his. And that Who Am I song where it says, I am yours. Abraham knows that he's God's. He's confident in that. He's been through a lot with God so far. He's stepped out in faith. It's credited to him as righteousness, it says. God does share his plans with Abraham because he's sharing more of himself with Abraham. God said he'd come to have a look, to see what the outcry against the evils of Sodom and Gomorrah was all about. Another important aspect of this passage, which I have missed before, I think, is that Abraham's not the only one praying here. There's an outcry that has reached God's ears saying you've got to do something about this. The evil that is being done by these two towns is outrageous. God, come and help. And those people aren't Abraham's people. They're not the people that God said, you're my special people. And God still listens and God still comes. Of course, God doesn't need to come in a human form to do that. He knows what's going on. But he's come to engage. He's revealing something of himself. In verse 22 then, the men, it says, turn away and go towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And then in verse 23, he approached God. And various biblical scholars will say that Hebrew word approached is a legal one of approaching a bench, approaching the judge. This is a deliberate step. So if we sum up this sort of journey so far, God's been dealing very intensely with Abraham over a number of years. God approaches Abraham in this chapter, but it's Abraham who runs to meet him. Abraham welcomes him in and hosts him. In that meeting, God reiterates his promise of a family, and Abraham is reminded of God's power. Abraham chooses to walk on with God, and God decides to share his plans to bring judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham. And then Abraham stands with God and approaches him. This is very much a two-way interaction. So we come to Abraham's intercession, which I think was brilliantly played out. Of course, Ian was deliberately chosen as the 99-year-old Abraham today. And didn't he do well? So Abraham intercedes for Sodom. He's praying for the Canaanites. which is quite bizarre. You know, these are the people that he's just really struggling with. But of course, he's praying because his nephew Lot is amongst them, and he wants Lot and his family to be saved. It's not the first time that Abraham's come back at God and questioned him. He's done it before in chapter 15 when he really challenged him about how on earth he could be the father of nations, given that he had no children. And then back in chapter 18, we see him doing the same. He's coming back at God. He does so worshipfully, respectfully, but boldly. He challenges God. He challenges God not to spare Sodom. For the sake of 50 righteous people, far be it from you to do such a thing. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And God says, yeah, okay, I won't destroy Sodom for the sake of 10 righteous people. And then Abraham returns to his own place as God goes on. So given what Abraham knew of God, he's confident to challenge him. He refers to God's character as he confronts him. Doesn't the judge of all the earth judge with justice, he asks. So he's pleading for salvation, for mercy, on the basis of a few righteous. There's a whole load of theological stuff there about Abraham being a priest and a precursor for Jesus that we don't have time for today. That's another one. We're going to focus on the intercession role that he's got here. But it is a precursor of that sort of standing in front of God that we see that Jesus does. But in chapter 19, God destroys Sodom. He doesn't spare Sodom. And he does save Lot, of course, just, well, 3 of the family of 4. But it seems like, what was the point of the negotiation? I think it's all about God engaging. He chose to share his plan. He was revealing something of himself. He was allowing Abraham to explore more about what he was like as well. As he was, you know, I'm sure it was true that if there were 10 righteous people there, he would not have destroyed the city. God gives the opportunity. God reveals his plans. But Abraham takes that opportunity and grows through the experience. It's not that God judges Sodom and Gomorrah because of his interaction, but rather that he includes Abraham somehow in that process. And Abraham is able to engage because of how much he understands of what God's done so far, including forgiving him when he's messed up. And Abraham knows that nothing is too hard from God because God's just told him that. And it's not a matter of, could you do this? Would you be able to do this? But please do this because I know you can and I know it's in your character. So this is just one example of intercession, I think, in the Bible, that business of standing between a need, a cry, and God, and pleading with him to do something, to change something, to act. And we see it throughout the Bible. There's lots of examples. I think this is probably one of the earliest ones in the Bible, but it's all through. We see Moses and Ezekiel standing in the breach, pleading for saving of the people that God has put in their care. We see lots of cries for salvation and mercy in the Psalms. We see Ezra prostrate before God when he realizes how corrupt Jerusalem is and how far from being that perfect new creation of God's city on return from exile. We see Paul constantly remembering his churches. And of course, we see Jesus interceding too, interceding for us believers in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we're assured as well that he continues to do so. So in Romans chapter 8, verse 26, which will come up on the screen, Paul says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So intercession is a really valid form of engaging with God. The intercessions we see in the Bible constantly refer to God's character. They refer back to God. They sort of remind the intercessor and God about, this is who you are. This is who you've shown yourself to be. And that's why I'm coming to you now. Abraham saying, you're just and you're righteous. Won't you please spare the righteous and have mercy? It's worshipful, but it's prepared to question. And when we can't work things out, it's prepared to really engage with God at wrestling with that too. And I think the intercessors are also willing to be changed by the encounter. I think intercession in the Bible is shown to be getting onto God's agenda, not just presenting a whole list of things that we'd like him to do. And it's really powerful. And it's powerful perhaps in ways that we don't understand at the time. So Abraham really stood before God and dared to challenge him and dared to barter with him because of the relationship he had with him. This was a new relationship. It was a building relationship. At 99 years old, he was still growing in that faith and certainly hadn't made it. And he was still engaging. But he was able, with the maturity that he did have, to know that he was part of that collaboration with God. And what's more, I think this intercessory interaction had an effect and built the faith and the understanding that Abraham would need for the next steps. So to understand the birth of Isaac, what that meant, to be prepared to go and sacrifice Isaac, to go and choose a wife for Isaac. It's more about perhaps Abraham learning how and why God operates than God listening to Abraham, although God listening to Abraham is also how God operates. At the end of his life, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 40, Abraham describes God as the Lord before whom I have walked. And it's that sense of constant journeying and constant interaction that I think we see played out here. I was a bit worried that I hadn't come up with a really good illustration for this talk today. There wasn't time anyway, but it actually also, I think, we don't need an illustration because we've got an example. This is an example for us out of the Bible about how to intercede and engage with God. That's what it's like. What is intercession like? Intercession is like somebody who knows a bit of God, who's coming to terms with God, what God has for him, who's imperfect, who keeps failing, but who keeps coming back and who dares to engage when he doesn't understand. It's interesting, I saw a tweet from Tim Keller this week, which said, and again it's coming up on the screen, I think we've got it. If you say, I believe in God, I trusted in God and he didn't come through, then you only trusted God to meet your agenda. So let's think about us then. What is the context of our journey? Where are we? What do we know of God already? How can we use Abraham's example to inspire and challenge our prayer life? I wonder if we're looking out for God and running to meet him and then going that extra way with him. I wonder if when he puts something on our heart, we're prepared to stand and approach him. I think that knowing what to pray for is sometimes difficult, but reading the Bible certainly helps. We can get promptings as we do so. We can find out more about God as we do so. We can pick up a characteristic of God and then go back to him with it and say, hang on a minute, if that's true, then why aren't you doing anything about this? I think that's fair, and that's what God would love us to do. I think we can also listen out for God prompting us. Listen to those visitors as they come over and remind us a bit more about what God is doing and what God is like. Listen to the prompting of the Holy Spirit, but also see what's going on around us and be part of that. So the effect of Sodom and Gomorrah's evil actions and their oppression of the region that they were in was affecting others, and they cried out, and others could cry out on their behalf. Where are those areas that we need to be crying out for now? It's not all about our personal faith relationship, but it will have an effect on that personal faith relationship, and we need to be prepared to be changed by it. So when we do come to God with those pleas, are we just laying out a list, or are we prepared to listen? Are we prepared to be changed? I think this example of Abraham also helps us to have permission to question when we don't understand or when it doesn't make sense. Hang on, I thought you were like this. Why aren't you acting like that? And we can be audacious. We can be bold in our request for God to explain himself, because he wants us to know him better. And also, he's big enough to take it. And I think, the best teachers really want to be questioned, don't they? And challenged. And they want people to ask why and not just take notes and take down everything they say. And those are the kind of learning and growing relationship that we can see that Abraham had with God. And one more quote. John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace, wrote another song that includes the words, "Thou art coming to a king, large petitions with thee bring. For his grace and power as such, none can ever ask too much." Are we really reflecting on what we know of God and growing through each encounter? And are we coming up with the big stuff and not just the little things? I was quite challenged last week in our community group, and we shared our prayer requests at the end, just as we normally do. We love supporting one another and praying for one another in that. And, some asked for some rest, to help with difficult relationships at work, for personal blessings, guidance in difficult decisions, etc. And only one of us, and it wasn't me, said that we should be praying for the elections, and that would be a really good thing to do corporately. And I was challenged by that I didn't do that. But it's great, I think, that there's more prayer in our services recently. It's great to pray together to bring those things before God. And we can do that in our small groups, and of course we can do that together. Last thing, really, I was reminded, I saw a picture, I don't know if anybody can read that. It says intercessor on the back windscreen of the Matatu that I was driving behind on the Nakuru Highway the other day. That really reminds me that actually at the bottom of all of this, we can have more confidence than Abraham did because of Jesus, our intercessor. We can really come before God in Jesus' name with a claim that when we come with our complaints, our queries, our arguments, our challenges, his is the kingdom, his the power, his the glory. And we have the authority through what he has done to stand in the breach. So this is the last of our prayer talks, our prayer series. I think it would be a great opportunity to break into small groups just for 5 minutes at the end of this to raise something up as an intercession to God, to plead with God about something that's on our hearts. You might like to do that alone, you might like to do that in pairs, or perhaps groups of 4, something like that. Really short, I would say let's have 1 minute of identifying something that's on our hearts to share with God and to cry out to him about. And then sort of 3 or 4 minutes of praying, and then take it forward with you through the week. And then after that, the music group is going to come up and we'll sing together the Lord's Prayer, because, of course, each of these talks has been separate aspects of prayer, but our prayer is never just one thing. There is all of that in all of it, whether it's confession or lament or intercession or praise or worship. All of those things, crying out for help, all fit under prayer, and I think that's all included in the Lord's Prayer. So we'll finish off with that as we sing. Just that's the way we'll close our group work. You'll know when it's over. So can we get into groups now? 2s, 3s, 1s, whatever suits you, and identify something you'd love to pray, you'd love to plead to God about. And you have 30 seconds to break into groups. Come on.